As America continues to decay into utter madness, many are looking to history in hopes of finding answers to our society's ailments. On this episode of Forge and Anvil, I will be joined by guest Will Tanner to discuss the forgotten history of Rhodesia. All this and more, so stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the cultural, political, and spiritual war that we are living in. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, doing my best to represent him well wherever I go. As I mentioned in the intro, I'm joined by Will Tanner. So, Will, go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yes, I'm Will Tanner, as he said. I'm originally from outside Atlanta, Georgia. I live in Virginia now. I started during law school, which I finished recently, the American Tribune network of properties. We do everything from digital marketing for other companies to kind of current entertainment, political news, to what I mainly focus on, which is history and its relation to the present. That's generally my sphere of the business at this point. I do that both on Substack, where I do long form pieces on mainly that and some things about current travesties, and then on Twitter, where I pretty much exclusively write about history, particularly the history of Europe before the Great War and of the post-colonial world, with a focus on Southern Africa, namely Rhodesia, and to some extent the Belgian Congo and South Africa.
Awesome. Well, glad to have you on. I'm looking forward to this conversation. But before we get started, for you listeners, feel free to head on over to forgeandanvil.substack.com. That is my Substack, where I put all of the episodes of the show as they release on podcast format. You can put in your email. It's completely free, and everything will get sent to your email whenever a new episode drops. And there is an option for you to throw a tip in the jar. In fact, this episode will actually be available early to those of you who are graciously doing so. And for those of you who are watching the free version live on YouTube, of course, we're not actually live, but you can always join the Substack as well if you want these episodes early. That is one perk that I have for my supporters. Then, of course, like and share this video. It really does boost us in the algorithm and helps more people to consume this content. And then, of course, you can follow me on Twitter or X at Forge and A for additional content and updates on the show. So that's all the laundry. So let's get into it. So yeah, Will, Rhodesia. So obviously, history and revisionist history is becoming a trend, both in my conversations that I have here on the show, as well as just the conversations of the everyday American, it seems like, especially in an election year when people are focusing on civics and history much more than they maybe otherwise would. But Rhodesia actually has it's fairly recent history, yet despite it being fairly recent history, it's not a part of the country, or excuse me, a part of the world that very many people focus on. Most people are not familiar where Rhodesia lies, what Rhodesia is. So maybe go ahead and just start from the beginning and tell us a little bit about Rhodesia. And as we continue on, we can kind of draw some lessons as we explore what exactly Rhodesia is.
Yeah, so just a brief 10,000-foot overview starting at the beginning. Cecil Rhodes, as you might suspect from the name Rhodesia, was the one who got it going, started it, got the concession from the monarchy, and made everything happen. His motives for doing so were twofold. One, he was a famed imperial promoter, a large supporter of the British Empire and its civilizing mission. He, amongst other things, wanted the British to settle large parts of Africa and wanted there to be a railroad from Cairo to Cape Town. It never ended up being entirely completed because of the very difficult stretch in the middle of sub-Saharan Africa, but it was largely completed. But to do that, he needed the territory that's now Zambia and Zimbabwe, or more specifically, the British Crown needed it in some form or another. The Crown, though, and Her Majesty's government was unwilling to expand at the time that Rhodesia opened up for colonization and settlement. The empire had already gotten expensive. It was yet to get more expensive, and people really didn't want to pay taxes to deal with entirely uncivilized, uncolonized. Nothing was going on in the Veldt or Rhodesia, or what Rhodesia became. There was a few tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 or so African pastoralists, but there's no civilization there. Rhodes, however, saw it as an opportunity to expand because it was so unsettled and generally empty. So he put together the Pioneer Column. It was a collection of men, mostly of the middle and lower classes, though, like Virginians, those with gentlemanly aspirations, who wanted to go into what became Rhodesia and settle it. So he put them together. It began Rhodesia's history of very strict immigration, where he screened out the freebooters and general ne'er-do-wells you might expect to be in a mercenary African expedition that wasn't approved by the Queen. But he put it together and sent it north, and settle Rhodesia they did. They dealt with the African tribes in the area. There wasn't really much violence or conflict. Some, of course, but there wasn't a large kingdom there, so there wasn't really much they had to do. They started mining. They were hopeful that there'd be gold in the region because there's so much gold in South Africa. There largely wasn't. There are some other resources there, like I believe cobalt. I forget what the others are, but it's some rare earth minerals that are necessary now, but weren't overly useful then. But though there wasn't gold, there was virgin soil, and quite fertile virgin soil at that. So that began Rhodesia's agrarian history, because the British South Africa Company, which, like Jamestown, was a private company that controlled the territory and was settling it, wanted settlers there. And it couldn't bring them in for mining. So it told them that the land was very fertile agricultural land and started giving it away or selling it for a small price. I forget exactly which, but it started bringing in settlers for large quantities of land that they could farm. And it had a very strict immigration policy where it only wanted pretty much British or Anglo-Saxons of good character who would fit into Rhodesia's culture, and brought them in as farmers. They started farming with the cash crop of, like Virginia, tobacco. It was quite successful at that, grew tremendously. The influx of settlers for the farming that was quite notable brought in large amounts of wealth from gentlemen and aristocrats who were fleeing England because of its high taxes and high regulation, and also because of the modern medicine that came along with it, led to a significant increase in the African population. Around 1921, I believe, Rhodesia became independent from the British South Africa Company and it became self-ruling. It remained part of the Commonwealth. Rhodesians had served in World War I. They served with even more distinction in World War II. A good number of them served as fighter pilots, such as future Rhodesian Prime Minister Ian Smith. The country's prosperity continued through the early and mid 20th century. It industrialized, and there was some urban development, particularly in Salisbury, which is now called Harare. But the country was really notable for its agriculture, particularly its tobacco, and to some extent its vineyards and wine. Then, after World War II, it had been promised independence, or it had been offered independence if it wanted it. It turned it down because it thought being part of the Commonwealth would be a good decision. That, however, came back to bite it in the 60s when decolonization kicked in, because I'm sure most people listening to this know, Africa really decolonized in the late 50s and early 60s. The European powers either were defeated or up and left in large part. The holdouts were the Rhodesians and the Portuguese. The Portuguese were in Mozambique, which borders Rhodesia, and in Angola were the two main theaters of note. The Rhodesians saw what happened in the Belgian Congo when the Belgians left. Particularly, there was the Kalamata crisis of 61, and then the Simba rebellion of 63 to 65. The Simbas were particularly awful because they were just so brutal. They were the ones who were known for sexually assaulting and murdering nuns, destroying monasteries, razing cities, and killing everyone in them. The Simbas were horrible, and the Rhodesians really saw them as the ends of decolonization. So when the British started pressing Rhodesia for majority rule, because Rhodesia was not an apartheid state like South Africa, instead, it was really a propertied voting republic. If you had a college education, you didn't really have to meet the property qualifications for the main voting roles. But if not, and most didn't have a college education, you had to have the equivalent of, I believe it was around the $60,000 in current dollars. So quite less than nominal dollars then. But that's a mental framework for how much it was. White or black, you had to have that amount of property in Rhodesia. The Western governments didn't like that, and the communists disliked Rhodesia because it was a Western free state. So in 65, instead of going along with the demands for majority rule and going along with British decolonization, the Rhodesians declared their unilateral Declaration of Independence from the Commonwealth. Other than America, they're the only state to do so, and their Declaration of Independence was modeled off of America's. The communists started supporting the rebels that were attacking Rhodesia. That had started to a small extent in 64, but really kicked in 65. The West then passed embargoes. It rammed them through the UN, which passed its first ever sanctions package, which was mandatory, unlike pretty much every other sanctions the United Nations passes. Initially, only South Africa and Portugal helped Rhodesia. Later, Israel did as well. And the Rhodesians then fought the communists that were backed by the West and backed by the communists from 1965-ish to 1979, when they had to give in because they were out of resources. And then Mugabe took over in 1980. And from there, the decline started, and it was pretty much over as a notable country by 2000.
So we start to see the decline. When did you say Mugabe took over?
1980.
1980. So 1980. So this country, basically 1965 is when they had their declaration, and they officially left the Commonwealth. So they really only survived for about 15 years as at least Rhodesia in the heritage sense. So as this decline started taking place, what began to happen to the sort of citizens of Rhodesia that consider themselves part of the original project?
Yeah, so the Rhodesia generally, as I mentioned, was an agricultural state. It had industry, it had cities, but the agrarian sector was really its claim to fame. But it grew cash crops. It was during the war it started growing grain, and because of that became the breadbasket of Africa. But really it was known for its cash crops. That's important because that's how these people made money. They had to export the tobacco to then make money, and Rhodesia earned foreign exchange, and with that it could buy things. But that became impossible during the Bush War because of the sanctions and because of the embargoes. It couldn't really export anything except to Portuguese Mozambique and South Africa, which is really only so helpful. So because of that, the internal Rhodesians started facing a large amount of pressure. The pressure really picked up with the terrorist attacks. They called the communist rebels terrorists, and largely they were terrorists infiltrating the country from outside. The terrorists were known for attacking farmer settlements. The laborers would live near the farmers themselves, and the terrorists would attack both the laborers and the farmers. So they started facing a large amount of pressure. They were really able to fight it off until 1974, which is when Portuguese Mozambique fell because Salazar's Portugal had fallen in the Carnation Revolution to the socialists. That's all to say. I'd say all of that because that puts in, it makes a mental picture of the situation the Rhodesians were facing. They not only couldn't make money by farming, which was really their trade, they also were facing constant rebel attacks. And while they'd been able to fight them off for a while, around 9 years or 10 years or so, it was really with the fall of Mozambique that people started feeling the need to exit because they weren't safe anymore and didn't have much of a future. That started to create a demographic crisis for Rhodesia because it was largely on those white Rhodesians that the armed services relied. The Rhodesian African Rifles are an exception, and a great number of blacks did sign up to fight for the Rhodesian security forces. But it needed the whites, it needed the Europeans to make its military what it was. And they started leaving in the mid-70s in large numbers, and it became a crisis for the state in 1979. That's when Nkomo, who he was one of the rebel leaders, his forces shot down 2 civilian airliners and bayoneted the survivors to death. And that really sparked a mass exodus in a way that you hadn't seen it in terms of any big event beforehand. And it was really that exodus, along with other issues like the destruction of Rhodesia's remaining oil reserves, that hastened the end of the state. So looking at what people inside did, at first they tried to fight, and they fought for a long time, quite bravely. But once it became too much, they left, largely for South Africa.
So talk to us a little bit about the racial element here, because of course, it seems as though my understanding of Rhodesia and its history, there was not a lot of racial animosity between white Rhodesians and black Rhodesians, but it does seem like the enemies that wanted to see Rhodesia destroyed tried very hard to sow animosity between those groups, because a lot of the white Rhodesians had they're essentially minority ruled because the public voting or the property rights based voting system ultimately more white Rhodesians were the ones that were owning property. So they naturally ended up taking more power for themselves despite being in the minority. So it seemed as though their enemies really tried to sow division based on race in order to collapse the country. So talk to us a little bit more about that, and feel free to provide any corrections if I'm off on that.
Yeah, just for looking at the voting, it's helpful to keep in mind how it worked. There were two voter rolls, the A roll and the B roll. It was the A roll for which you needed the $60,000 or so in terms of modern currency of property. It was the B roll that it was either a nominal property requirement or none at all. I think it was nominal. But so it was, as you said, mainly whites were on the A roll, a good number of blacks, but certainly not the majority. And also the tribal chiefs had positions reserved in the legislature that mattered and that the A-roll was electing. So the blacks did have a certain amount of representation regardless of voting patterns and property in the legislature. Similarly, the B-roll was largely what determined local elections. So in terms of how it affected them in their lives, really, the blacks were still pretty much able to vote on that sort of issue. It was really the national issues for which the A-roll mattered. So they were excluded in some ways from national decision making, but it didn't really matter that much for their lives because of how local matters were handled. Still, though, they were excluded, and that was an issue that cropped up in the West and was part of the reason for Rhodesia's demise in terms of Western propaganda. But because the system was fair and because they still did have a voice on really the issues that mattered to them, there were never hostile relationships between blacks and whites of the sort you saw in South Africa, say, where apartheid really turned up the heat or increased the pressure on that just simmering animosity, which has become a large issue for South Africa. You never saw that in Rhodesia. Ian Smith, for example, he was known for having good relationships with the tribal chiefs, and his government was known for investing, despite the war, heavily in the infrastructure for the African villages or for the black villages. So the blacks quite liked him. There are stories of this. For one, thousands of blacks signed up to fight for the Rhodesians. Similarly, when the terrorists were attacking the Rhodesian state or infiltrating, if the black villagers caught them, often they, instead of letting them go, would just turn them over to the Rhodesian security forces because they supported Ian Smith's government. So it was there internally, there were never really hostile relations, at least on a scale that mattered. What there were a certain number of internal communists like Mugabe and Nkomo, who were the two rival rebel leaders. And they, once they were released from prison, they fled the country. And while outside the country, first in Zambia and later in Mozambique and Zambia, received communist aid, received communist support, and received a large number of rebels and communists from outside the country who were willing to invade and attack it. So the war and the appearance of racial hostility was never really an internal thing, and never. I hesitate to say never because it's not entirely accurate. There were examples of animosity, and to some extent, the rebels came from Rhodesia rather than externally. But largely, that wasn't the case. Largely, this was an external attack on Rhodesia, using the racial angle as a reason for the attack in an inaccurate way. You see this really well in American disdain for and attacks upon Rhodesia. The presidents like Carter and Nixon and the rest applied the American civil rights and Jim Crow lens to Rhodesia in a way that was inaccurate. It might have been accurate for, say, South Africa, but it was very inaccurate for Rhodesia. But it created the appearance that backing Rhodesia would be backing white minority rule rather than just backing a free Western state. And so the West was largely skeptical of the idea that Rhodesia should be supported for that reason. But it was never a real racial issue inside the state in the way that external states tried to frame it as one.
Of course, there's a lot of lessons that I'm sure we can pull from Rhodesia, but one thing that is immediately coming to my mind is it seems similarly in America, there's a lot of parallels. I think that when you talk to the average American, there's really not a lot of racial animosity. it really does seem as though there is a lot of goodwill and grace towards different ethnic backgrounds among Americans. But then, of course, when you look at the news cycle, it seems as though we're constantly in a racial war, especially at the height of 2020. And obviously, race relations have gotten worse. But the greater point I'm trying to make is it does seem like it's an outside fabrication, like it's an outside attack on the culture that really, especially as you look into the 90s. And obviously, we have so many issues that I could talk about, even in the 90s. But when it comes to race relations, they were pretty good in the 90s, in the early 2000s. And then you start to see, especially underneath Barack Obama and many others, the race relations start to sour again. But it really does seem like to the average American, it was sort of an outside perspective coming in and trying to convince everyday Americans, no, Black Americans are being oppressed still to this day. Even though Jim Crow is done away with, slavery is done away with, and these white people, they're a bunch of racists. And then similarly, you could see the narrative in the opposite light. So it really does seem like there's sort of a propaganda war currently in America to sort of sow division. And it seems as though that is one of the parallels that America has to Rhodesia, where there was an outside force trying to sow division, maybe unsuccessfully at times, but especially when we look in as outsiders, we look and maybe see racial animosity that wasn't actually there. But that is one of the ways that, from what I'm understanding you saying, that's a lot of why the West was in opposition to Rhodesia, because we were looking through our American lens at Rhodesia. We had just gotten involved in civil rights legislation, and we then applied that lens to Rhodesia and said, this white minority ruled country, despite it prospering and not seeming to have a lot of racial issues, we just assumed that it was bad because we had that Western lens applied to it.
Yeah, America is something of a hard example for the race relations part, just because on one side you have the history of slavery and Jim Crow, and on the other you have decades of extremely high black on white crime and violence. And I think that does create a simmering tension that Rhodesia didn't have, just because they didn't have affirmative action. They didn't have the crime problem we have, nor did they ever have slavery or Jim Crow. Or if they had slavery, it was blacks enslaving blacks, not whites doing the same. So I think it's hard to directly apply just that aspect of it. I do think it's very accurate that the framing of both problems is entirely a Marxist one or entirely a communist one. And when we talk about both things, we're either rebutting or agreeing with the communist framing of it, generally the communist media framing of it, where it's either racism is that bad or racism isn't that bad, instead of just saying, well, there was a hierarchy there amongst people, but it wasn't an entirely racial one. It was based on other characteristics. In America, similarly, it's really the communist framing is what's discussed, for better or worse. But I do think in both cases, it's the left, it's the communists who created the frame through which we view and discuss these issues, which is probably unfortunate, but I think very much baked into the cake.
Yeah. So then as Rhodesia continues to decay, how would you describe sort of the final chapter of Rhodesia?
Yeah, that would come in 78 and 79. So at that point, the war had been going on for 14 years or so, 14, 15 years. The fighting had gotten a lot worse ever since Mozambique fell with the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. It had not only gotten more violent, but more widespread and more constant, and larger numbers were involved. It had just gotten worse in pretty much every way. And not only that, but the Rhodesians were running out of people because people were leaving, and they're running out of supplies because though Israel was aiding them at that point, the Portuguese weren't. And the South Africans, after Salazar's Portugal fell and lost Angola and Mozambique, decided that they would take a different view of things on the continent. And whereas they had up till that point largely been supporting Rhodesia, They thought that Rhodesia was doomed anyway, and that they would have better relations with their future and current neighbors if they just kind of pushed Rhodesia away and stopped aiding it. So, whereas before they'd been sending troops and policemen into Rhodesia and shipping in a large number of arms and generally aiding it, after around 74, the South Africans were pretty hostile to Rhodesia. And though they aided it in the future in some ways, they were really the ones dragging it to international peace conferences, and they were the ones stabbing it in the back inside Southern Africa. So the South Africans became a problem for Rhodesia. So at that point, it was pretty much alone in terms of any allies that mattered. It didn't have weapons anymore. It didn't have enough people. And in 1979, it lost its last fuel reserves. Up until 1974, it had pretty much been able to import oil only through the port of Beira in Mozambique. But obviously, after Mozambique fell, it couldn't do that anymore. So it was coasting on reserves. It ran out of them when they were blown up. So once it was out of people, out of weapons, and out of oil, and out of allies, it had to give in. And so it gave in by accepting the idea that there would be majority rule and there would be mass democratic elections in which anyone could be elected. The first guy who was elected was something of a semi-moderate. He wasn't a Rhodesian, really, at least not an outlook. But he also wasn't Mugabe. He wasn't as bad. And Ian Smith thought he was someone with whom they could work to create a state that at least functioned, even if it didn't prosper in the same way. Mugabe then said that that election had been unfair and they needed to do it over. The West backed him in saying it needed to be done over so it would be more fair to the rebels. So the British came in as advisors and to make sure it was fair. It wasn't fair. Mugabe sent his thugs to terrorize the villagers and threaten them with death or torture if they didn't vote for him. So they voted for him, and he was elected in 1980. And that's really when Rhodesia's story ended and Zimbabwe's began.
Mm-hmm. So then how would you describe the changes that occurred as Rhodesia becomes Zimbabwe? What were the sort of the most notable changes that we can look at objectively between the two nations?
Yeah, so there are a couple things. One is that, so there hadn't been internal strife of a racial or ethnic sort in any real way in Rhodesia. There had been outside communist infiltration that used some internal people, of course, but that wasn't white versus Shona or Shona versus Ndebele violence. It was just a civil war and communist versus free conflict. Once Mugabe was in charge, he wanted to solidify his power and address historic grievances. The Matabele or Ndebele, depending on which translation you like, were traditionally the oppressors of the Shona. Mugabe was a Shona, Nkomo was a Matabele, or Ndebele, whichever one you like. So Mugabe, once he was in charge, pretty much the first thing he did was the Gurukundi, in which his Chinese communist trained troops massacred about 20 to 30,000 of the Ndebele tribe to address the historic grievance and solidify his power, which that really did succeed in solidifying his power amongst the blacks because he didn't have internal enemies amongst the blacks at that point. After that, he seized the guns of the white farmers and left them defenseless. He, up until that point, had been somewhat pleasant and willing to work with them, or at least seemed like it. But then after that, the gloves were off, and pretty soon thereafter, he confiscated the farmland. So those were the macro political changes in terms of what he affected. In terms of how that affected things on the ground, first is that Rhodesia was a free state. Freedom of speech, freedom of property, freedom to own firearms, freedom to associate with whom you pleased. Those are really, I think, the key freedoms, and freedom of religion, of course. It was free. You could do what you wanted. There were bounds on that. It was ordered liberty rather than licentiousness, but still, it's what we would think of as a free country. It was really Britain transplanted in Africa before Britain became a communist hellhole. Yes. And for that reason, the Rhodesians were known as more British than the British. It was really an old school Western state. Then Mugabe, when he was in power, destroyed all that, and it became an unfree state. He had bands of thugs who would terrorize you if you're even considered a critic of the regime. So there's no more free speech. He confiscated guns. There's no more guns. Confiscated property, so property rights are dead. it was just, I don't really get the indication he cared that much about religion. I could be wrong on that, but communists are generally hostile to it. And so freedom is gone in Zimbabwe. It's an African dictatorship that's chaotic and anarchic, but very much not free. That's what Zimbabwe became in terms of rights. So a massive change, much for the worse. In terms of economics, Rhodesia had been a prospering state. It was not only industrializing, but as I mentioned, had a significant agricultural base. Originally, that had been tobacco, but during the war, because they couldn't export or import anything, they needed to grow their own food. So Rhodesia switched from being really a tobacco producer mainly to being a grain producer mainly. And it was quite successful at growing grain. Rhodesia didn't have the legacy of farming that a lot of European countries had. So instead of having 100-acre farms fenced in by hedgerows and stone walls, which look pretty but are inefficient, it was much more like the fields of Ukraine or the fields of the American prairie, where it's just endless fields. As long as you want to farm in whatever square mileage you want to farm, they could do that there with mechanized modern equipment, where they didn't have the issues a lot of European states had in transitioning to modern agriculture. So they could farm just these huge swaths of land that were quite fertile because they'd never been farmed before in any real way. So they were successful at growing grain well, even after the Bush War, when Mugabe hadn't confiscated the farms yet. Rhodesia was the breadbasket of Africa. It was successful at growing grain and exported it in huge quantities to countries that needed it, because all the countries around it, other than South Africa at that point, were disaster zones that needed grain imports. Then Mugabe got rid of property rights, confiscated the farms of the white farmers in the name of racial equity and grievance politics, took them, hated the whites, kicked the whites out. Some were killed as he did so, but because there wasn't racial grievance, there's no genocide. Instead, they just were kicked out. But he took their land. The people to whom he gave it, it's hard to say this without sounding dismissive, but really, even under the Rhodesian state, a lot of black farmers, they weren't really even using mules. They were just like plowing small ruts in the ground with sticks and planting grain that way. It's what they were doing. Not all of them, of course, but largely. You can't be a grain exporting state in the modern world if you're using sticks to farm. Similarly, if you've been using sticks to farm, it's really hard to transition to phosphorus-based fertilizers and modern tractors that cost $1 million a pop, or even the older ones that weren't quite that expensive. So they just couldn't do it. They didn't grow any more grain. It was a disaster. The fields largely lied fallow, or they tried to farm them and it was a disaster, so they gave up and then they laid fallow. So Rhodesia stopped exporting grain and became not internally prosperous or internally food independent. That was also a problem economically, because with agricultural exports, that was how Rhodesia earned its foreign exchange credits and its ability to buy things abroad and import them into Rhodesia. People forget that, but that's a key ingredient of exports, is earning foreign exchange. Mugabe obviously didn't understand that, because when he destroyed the farming sector, they couldn't export anything, so they were no longer earning that. Not only could they then not import the food and medicine they needed, they couldn't pay the interest on their internationally held bonds. And the confluence of those issues and others really is what led to Zimbabwean hyperinflation, just the inability to import or pay debt interest. So Rhodesia was the successful modern state. Zimbabwe was just this hellish backwater that had hyperinflation and famine. So really, that covers most of society, but those are the two big changers. It went from being free to enslaved, and it went from being prosperous to starving.
It's unfortunate to look back and see that transition. So, I mean, obviously, you've been talking about Rhodesia for a while now, and you've been following the history of Rhodesia and trying to bring some of that to the front of people's minds, as it's something that's, unfortunately, even though it's recent, it's very much forgotten. And especially those of us living here in America. But you mentioned at the outset that you try your best to apply history to modern day and take lessons from your research and apply it to our current situation. So what kind of lessons do you think that viewers of this podcast episode should be taking away from Rhodesia and its tragic history?
Yeah, one is the diplomatic history of Rhodesia. I didn't really talk about that much because it's convoluted and tiresome to talk about. But Ian Smith, who was the prime minister, was dragged to peace conference after peace conference all the time. The British and Americans and Zimbabwean rebels claimed that they were operating in good faith and just wanted to strike a deal that would be good for everyone. That was entirely untrue. They wanted to wear Rhodesia down and replace Ian Smith with some dictator in a ridiculous suit of the sort Mugabe was known to wear. There was no good faith. They wanted to destroy Rhodesia. So, and that was the point of these peace conferences, was just to waste his attention and wear him down and give him false hopes. That was the point. So I think that's important to keep in mind, because when you're dealing with people of the Mugabeite mold and the type of British or Americans who supported him, the egalitarians, there's no negotiating with those people. They want to destroy you. If you have any concept of hierarchy, any concept of tradition, they despise you and want to destroy you. You can't negotiate with them because that's their goal. You can't argue with a tiger as your head is in its mouth. So there's that. There's no negotiating with these people. The second is, I think, the impetus of what happened to Rhodesia and what Zimbabwe became. There's this. Oh, sorry. Were you saying something?
No, go ahead.
Oh, the yellow lit up. I thought you're.
Oh, no problem.
Okay. Yes. Sorry for that, guys. But like I was saying, the impetus. There's this theory, particularly when you start talking about these things on X or similar places, even in person. People say, "Oh, well, it was all for the money. Western corporations pushed this because Exxon wanted to drill in Angola, or American mining interests wanted to extract cobalt from Zimbabwe without paying the Rhodesian government taxes," or whatever. It's this ridiculous facile argument that this was all a corporate plot to lower their tax burden or something. That's not what happened. Exxon isn't having a great time in Angola. It's not having a great time in Equatorial Guinea. If it wanted to do that, it would have backed Simon Mann in the 2004 coup in Equatorial Guinea. It didn't, because that's not what this is about. Rather, what happened to Southern Africa, which was this glistening jewel of civilization, and people don't remember this, but the Belgian Congo, most of the crimes that King Leopold is accused of never happened. It was natives doing that to natives before the Belgians pacified the place completely. The Belgian Congo was this glimmering jewel of civilization in the heart of darkness, where they carved railroads and cities out of jungle. Similarly, Angola and Mozambique were relatively pleasant places. The Portuguese weren't particularly hard masters, and they built the countries into a lot of things that wouldn't have been there otherwise. Rhodesia is the same, as is South Africa, though South Africa did have the apartheid angle, which is bad for its own reasons. But you have to keep in mind, that's what Southern Africa was. It was this prosperous place where if you were profit-minded, you could do business. Well, in fact. But then it was destroyed by Western governments. The communists obviously were involved in supporting rebels, supplying them with arms, funding them, and all that. But the only reason the rebels ever succeeded in these places is because America and Britain let them. And didn't just let them, but often encouraged them in doing so. So why would America and Britain do that? There are two things. One is race communism, which I broadly define, and I've gotten this from other people. I'm not coming up with this on my own. It's the idea that the supposed oppressor group, almost always white people, has to pay and suffer for the supposed sins they committed against the oppressed group, which is almost always black people of some sort, particularly in Africa. It's often historically nonsensical. How are the Africans oppressed by having modern medicine and sewage infrastructure put in their countries?
Right.
But it is what's pressed. It's saying, oh, this is horrible. You have to pay for this. But again, it's not really economic. It's not that they want the Africans to be better off financially at the end of it. It's that they want the supposed oppressor group to suffer a lot. They want them to feel pain. They want them to be hurting. They want them to die. So that's what you saw in the Congo. It's what you saw in Rhodesia. So the race communists, whether it's Kamala Harris saying that black people should get a special subsidy when they buy houses, or it's Mugabe screaming about black power farms in Zimbabwe, it's the same impulse. They want you to suffer. That's really the goal of all this. It's not making their client groups that much better off. Certainly not better off in real terms as opposed to nominal ones. But additionally, while that's a large part of the impetus, the other part of the impetus is egalitarianism, which it's the idea that people aren't just interchangeable economic units, though they think that's true. And they think that everyone has equal potential and capabilities that just are waiting to be exploited or improved upon or whatever. But that anything that denies that supposed reality, that shows that theory to be untrue and absurd in every way, needs to be destroyed. And Rhodesia showed that that theory was ridiculous. It was a prosperous, thriving state in Africa that was free pretty much entirely because it excluded incompetent people from having a hand in government through the specific requirements for the A voter list or the roll A voter list. I mean, that was the basis of its success and why it was so prosperous. And that just shows the lie that is egalitarianism.
Right.
We're not interchangeable economic units. We're equal in the eyes of God. That's true, but that doesn't mean that anyone can be an astronaut if only they put their mind to it. So I think the reasons Africa were destroyed were not economic. It was because of the race communism and because of the egalitarianism. And really all that also shows the other point, which is that you can't negotiate with those people. So those are the political lessons to be learned. They're self-defense ones as well, but those are the political ones.
Right. Yeah, and it's unfortunate because, of course, again, there's a lot of parallels that we see in our, American situation here, and egalitarianism, of course, is a lot of what's gotten America into this mess as well. Whether we're talking about theological egalitarianism or just broad sweeping cultural egalitarianism. I think that Rhodesia is a prime example why mass democracy fails. And of course, the founding fathers talked about that at length, and most individuals, at least on the modern day right, understand that to a degree. That's what they're referring to when people say we're a republic, not a democracy. But that's ultimately what we're battling. Is we're battling a group of egalitarians that they want democracy in the truest sense. They want individuals who have no right, making political decisions for the vast majority of the country. They want those individuals to have power because they think they should for one reason or another. Whether they've earned it or not is not part of the debate. But at the end of the day, Rhodesia is really just a real fire alarm for Americans everywhere to remember that if you don't push back against these people who try to use they try to appeal to your idea of fairness or your sympathies in order to gain power, and then once they have power, they don't let you keep it. I mean, a prime example is when they say a threat to our democracy, they no longer mean democracy anyways. They just mean our oligarchy or a threat to the total state. And so but of course they're going to use the heartstrings that you have. They're going to try to pull on those heartstrings. Shouldn't every individual get the right to vote the exact same way? Shouldn't we make voting so much more accessible, even to the illegal immigrant who owns nothing here in America, just walked across the southern border yesterday? Shouldn't they also have a say in the future of this great country? And it works. And that also goes to prove why egalitarianism is a bad mindset, because it doesn't take much for these low information voters to get mobilized. And then we see 81 million votes come in for Joe Biden, and we see America that was by many metrics much more prosperous a few years ago immediately take a massive hit. And here we find ourselves in 2024 asking whether or not we're going to do another 4 to 8 years of this same madness, or whether or not we're going to turn the page on it. So any additional thoughts to anything that I said there, Will, and any closing takeaways that you want to throw out to the audience?
Yeah, one thing is that America's history really tracks Rhodesia's in a lot of ways. The racial angle is different, but the ideological things are similar, and even some of the surface level similarities. Virginia, founded as a corporate colony, growing tobacco, a gentlemanly place where people who were of middle or lower class origins could better themselves, become gentlemen, really ended up being destroyed because of egalitarianism and the war between the states. It was a different situation from a racial angle than the Rhodesian Bush War, but really similar in a lot of ways that people might not want to consider. But if they look at what happened to Rhodesia with horror, there are a lot of other places that you should look at their fate with horror as well. Not just the Old Dominion, but Britain with the Parliament Bill and its current disaster. Canada, what's happening to it right now with just mounds and mounds of immigrants from all the various refuse spots of the world, and all of Southern Africa. There's all these places, pretty much everywhere other than the Middle Eastern monarchies you could name, where egalitarianism at one point or another was the dominant ideology of the state, and the state was completely wiped away as a force for good because of that. And what replaced it was just tyranny of the worst, most abominable kind that was awful because it destroyed what makes us different and what makes places prosperous. You need those. You need the best to be able to show that they're the best if you want to be a prosperous place. You can't be internally knocking the what's the Greek story about the tyrant who would go around knocking the poppies off that grew taller than the rest, so the field of flowers would all be the same height.
Right.
That's Mugabe. That's Kamala Harris. That's Harold Wilson. It's the same story. It's Lincoln. It's the same story over and over again. So you have to fight it because it is evil. And I think people need to learn that and remember it.
Yeah. Well said. Well, we'll kind of use that as our closer. But Will, where can people go to keep up with you and everything that you have going on?
Yeah, the two best. Twitter is, or I spend too much time on Twitter like a lot of other people. I'm at Will_Tanner_1. I respond to most DMs unless you look like a bad actor, and I try and respond to most comments. I'm also on Substack at theamericantribune.news. That's where I might write my more long form pieces, and similarly, I'd try and respond to most comments and DMs on there unless it's just something absurd. So if you're not absurd, I'll do my best to respond. So that's where you can contact me.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining, Will. Really appreciate you stopping by. And thank you, listener, for joining us as well, whether you're listening to this early or you're listening to this as it drops on all platforms. But feel free either way to check out the Substack, forageandanvil.substack.com. That is home to the podcast. You can type in your email there for free, and you can throw a tip in the tip jar if you feel inclined. But we appreciate all of you listening. And as always, have a fantastic rest of your day. And